So please welcome Dr. Phil Coker from the University of Reading.
Thanks, Richard. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I first off really want to explain why an energy engineer is here talking at a Highways conference. Just a couple of years back, I'm not sure that's something I would have foreseen myself, but increasingly it makes perfect sense. I joined the gas industry back in the 90s, and most of my days on site were right in the middle of the dash for gas. So I spent a lot of time at my local power station putting gas supplies into what then became electricity generation from gas. Struck me there was probably more than that in the future, though, so I was keen to understand what came next after gas. That got me thinking about renewables. Was this going to be a thing or not? Which led me into academia. The question at the center of a lot of my research these days is, well, if we are going to have a lot of renewables on the system, hang on, what happens when the wind doesn't blow? That focus on variability of supply, variability of demand is at the heart of a lot of what I'm doing. Now that takes us then to this one that everybody's heard about. Do we need lots of energy storage? And that takes you to this focus on electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are basically a big battery on wheels. So if we are going to bring a lot more electric vehicles into our transport system, what does that mean for the energy network? Might that actually bring a benefit back to the power system as well? Amongst the projects that I'm working on at the moment, I'm working with a small company called Drive Electric. They're an electric vehicle leasing specialist, but they're trying to bring controlled charging as a service to the market, and that to me seems one of the really helpful bits and pieces in trying to bring about more renewable energy, which is more or less my day job. So some somewhat complicated graphs for you, but each of them to make one particular point. This is the UK energy system. This is all the flows of energy coming in on the left, so that's gas at the top, then you see coal coming in, then electricity from nuclear generation, and at the bottom you see oil coming into the system. And over on the right of this graph, you see where we use energy. And if we zoom in on that a little bit, then there's industry at the top, transport in the middle, and domestic homes down at the bottom. Now let's just slow up and look at the colors a minute. The sort of fuchsia-y color on there is electricity. So I've skipped a bit out of this focused one, but mainly that's the electricity that we move around the country. Now look at the aquamarine, how much energy we move through petrol and diesel. Are we really saying that we're going to shift that amount of energy onto the electricity system? Well, I'm going to have a go at telling you that that's doable, but we really shouldn't understate how big a challenge that is. I mean, the good news is electric cars, it's a much more efficient way of using energy than burning petrol in an internal combustion engine is, so you can actually cut that green bit down to about a third anyway, so that takes us in the right direction. Now some good news for you. I'm not really sure how many people get this. I'm not sure how many people really appreciate how much our energy system has been changing recently. This is the build rate of renewable generation across the last decade. Green, wind energy, the orange on there is solar energy. Give you some numbers on context. To put this in context, the 2017 figures, that's adding up to about 30 gigawatts of installed generation from wind energy and solar energy in the UK power system. Peak demand in the middle of winter is about 60 gigawatts. On a summer's day in summer, demand on the system can be below 30 gigawatts. So we've got more installed capacity of renewables on the system already than a low demand day in the summer, or a low demand hour in the summer. Now, in fairness, the wind doesn't always blow at the same strength across the whole country, and it doesn't always blow at the same time as the sun is shining. We've hit the point now where there are hours in the year where we're getting about 50% of electricity demand from renewables. That's happening across a small number of hours in the year at the moment, but this is growing rapidly. And this is a view into what I spend most of my days thinking about. These are snapshots of energy supply on the left, energy demand on the left, and then energy supply from solar in the middle, and energy supply from wind on the right. So these are 1 year, and half-hourly variation within the year. So step down it to get days in the year, step across it to get hours in the day. The middle one, solar, is the easiest one to get your head around. We can all get fairly quickly that it's fairly sunny in the middle of the day in the middle of summer. It's really not that sunny in the middle of the night in the middle of winter. So the game that we then can play is, how do we add up the middle one and the right-hand one? How do we add up solar and wind to get a pattern that somehow meets what our electricity demand looks like at the moment? And just worth pausing a minute, actually, and looking at the wind one and the behavior there, that wind tends to stay the same across a day or two or three. So we get some windy days, and then we get some not so windy days. So what's the implication of that for how we're going to manage the energy system? Right, let's move towards vehicles now. Focusing in on a single house, the orange plot that we're seeing here is how electricity demand typically varies across a house through a day. And you're seeing, shouldn't come as a surprise if you think about the energy system, demand is at its greatest in the early evening. Now, the blue laid over there is real data from a trial of electric vehicles run by Western Power Distribution. And this is what happens if people connect electric vehicles to the system and we don't give them incentives to do anything different. Funnily enough, most of us get home from work at the end of the day, we put our electric car on to charge, and that bangs a big demand on the power grid at exactly the moment in time when the power grid is least able to cope with it. So that is the worst case scenario and an absolute nightmare for our distribution networks. Okay, so I've been told to talk about challenges and actions. And the first challenge is, well, are our networks big enough? If we want to move all of this energy demand of a vehicle fleet onto the power networks, will our networks take it? Actually, there's some good news in here. The good news is if you look at the orange plot of existing electricity demand, now look away from peak time, you see that there is really quite a lot of capacity in the system. Power systems built for peak demand. There are a lot of times, even in the middle of the day, certainly overnight, when there's a lot of spare capacity in the system. So this question of, is the network big enough? Yes, it's big enough as long as we don't try and charge our cars at system peak. As long as we can start to move our charging behavior away from system peak, we've got the capacity there. Now, there are local pinch points that are going to be an issue, and there are local use cases that are going to be an issue. So don't let me tell you this is easy, but the network can do it. Then a question that's very much of the moment, have we got enough power stations to electrify our vehicle fleet? Well, actually, the answer is the same as the last one. It's sort of the wrong question. If the power system can provide that system peak, and I'm telling you that that's big enough to power the vehicle fleet, then by definition, we've got enough power stations to do it at the moment. The actual question is, where are we going to get the fuel from to put into those power stations? So it's not about, oh, we need 10 new Hinkley points. It's not about we need 10 new power stations. But it's, where are we going to get our fuel from? Now, at the moment, the default is, if we want to do anything new with the electricity grid, then we're going to burn more gas to do it. That's the thing that flexes. That's the thing that changes within the power system at the moment. So worst case scenario is we move our vehicle energy demand from petrol to gas. Now, actually, that in itself is not a bad thing, but way better if we continue increasing the amount of renewable generation on the system, and actually that becomes a win-win with vehicle electrification, because all the things that I care about in my day job, vehicles can really help us integrate greater amounts of renewables. So what's next? Will user behavior, user demands become a blocker? So actually, will we tolerate not being able to charge our cars the moment we want to, but accepting that we'll charge our cars when it's beneficial to the system? And that's just the driver question. What about the institutional blockers? What about if you've invested very heavily in service stations and you've got a big business locked into providing petrol into cars? How are you going to feel about electrification? What about supermarkets? You've invested very heavily in petrol forecourts. What about charging standards for chargers that are going into homes? Can we create those things quickly enough? I'm actually pulling up on that supermarket example for the last one. I was fortunate enough to have the sustainability manager of one of our major supermarkets present an event for me the other week. And he's trying to write their EV strategy. And he makes a very simple statement. If they're going to promote electric vehicle charging in their car parks, they need a common solution that every customer sees. So they want a customer who can come to any of their supermarkets across the country and see exactly the same thing in their car parks to plug their vehicle in. Now, that's problematic to me because I'm getting really excited working with a small business who can innovate very quickly. So how do we leave that open market for new entrants at the same time as we come up with a common look of the solution to car drivers and car users? And then just to wrap up, what do I see that we need to do to bring this about? First couple of things on here are really aimed at my world, the energy market. First one, we need to stop subsidizing dumb chargers. Controlled charging can solve a lot of the problems. At the moment, we are using taxpayers' money to fund uncontrolled chargers, which is making it that much harder to bring controlled chargers to market. So that needs to change. I think that message is getting through. The next one on that similar theme, behind the scenes in the energy market, there is a time-varying price signal. So the wholesale electricity is cheaper at certain times of day. It is cheaper when the wind's blowing more strongly. But how do we get that signal to vehicle users so that actually there is an incentive to me not to charge my car at evening peak when I get home from work, but there's an incentive for me to charge my car in the middle of the night or in the middle of the day when there's lots of solar generation on the grid? They're very much problems for my world. What about for the highways world? Well, there is going to be some need for on-demand charging and some need for rapid charging. I don't see refueling cars at motorway services stopping as a thing anytime soon, but that's kind of the hardest thing for the power grid to do. The flows of energy that we're talking about in a petrol station are huge in electricity terms. So it's more costly for the power grid. We need to get customers and drivers used to the fact that that's a premium service, and we're going to need to pay more for it. We need to be moving towards a world where the preference is for discretionary charging at home and in workplaces. But we have rapid charging, we have on-demand charging when we really need it, and we're prepared to pay for that. And then just to wrap up, this is a real buzz phrase in the energy research and energy policy community at the moment, this idea of whole systems thinking. I'm not quite sure anybody really knows what it means or can describe it very effectively, but it's a real call to arms for us here today that increasingly my world of energy systems and power systems are becoming inextricably linked with your world of highways networks, and we really need to look at those two things together. We need to look where there's capacity in the power network, where there's a need in the transport network, and we need to get those things lined up. That's not easy. That needs clever people to sort that problem out.